Almost 80 years ago, the largest amphibious invasion in history took place, which would change the course of the war. Years of war had already ravaged city and town alike when the Allied troops landed in Normandy. They were met with stiff resistance across 50 miles of French coastlines. So much was destroyed, but has since been built back up. Let's take a look at what places look like now compared to World War II. Let's start with Weymouth, southern England. On the days leading up to D-Day, numerous British towns were filled with troops, the majority of which were from the United Kingdom, United States, and Canada, though there were people from many other countries that participated in the Battle of Normandy. Pictures of 1944 Weymouth, southern England. We see boats filled to the brim with troops, waiting to take part in Operation Overlord. These days, there's a quiet walkway, no sign of battleships in sight. Next, Moreton in Marsh, England. In the weeks and days before D-Day, supplies and ammunition were stored in town squares. No markets, no cars, no family strolling about, but boxes filled with ammunition. A lot of the integrity of Moreton in Marsh's town square has been preserved, many of them saved from the worst damage. Even the little bell tower has stood the test of war and time. But now the town square is overflowing with cars, and there are no stockpiled supplies or ammunitions in sight. You'll still have a hard time finding a parking spot. And now, Esplanade in Weymouth, England. In those days leading up to D-Day, there was an endless stream of troops on their way to embark on ships that were bound for Omaha Beach. Almost 80 years later, the shops have long been restored and thriving. Families walk these streets now, where men who didn't know whether they would ever see their homeland again walked all those years ago. Next up, Omaha Beach, Normandy. Those first moments when the Allied invasion reached the shore were both terrifying and beautiful. Terrifying because this was war, and war isn't pretty. So many would never go home, a price they knew some would have to pay for peace so that Omaha Beach, then filled with machines of war, would one day look like it does today. Clean, peaceful, the perfect place to camp and take a walk. Not even a whisper of war remains in the sand. Following, Place du Marche, France. The main square of a town is always a center of life, where you find the markets and events. But in times of war, they become glaring stages for the horror that is war. Here in 1944, a dead German is left in the middle of the square, uncared for, after the town was taken by U.S. troops. The same square where today the buildings look like they were never damaged, and the people crossing the open space don't remember the lives that were lost there either. And then we have Saint-Aubin-sur-Mer, France. The beautiful coastline of Saint-Aubin-sur-Mer is absolutely an amazing place to spend a lazy summer day when it's teeming with life. Sticky ice cream fingers and sand between your toes, or shopping for a souvenir somewhere near the waterfront. But those days in June 1944, there was a crashed U.S. fighter plane burned out on the beach. Because back then, Saint-Aubin-sur-Mer was a Juno Beach D-Day landing zone where more Allied troops would come in to support Operation Overlord. Next, Saint-Aubin-sur-Mer, Nan-Red Beach, France. On May 6, 1944, the Royal Marine Commandos of Headquarters 4th Special Brigade of the British 2nd Army was making its way onto Nan-Red Beach in the Juneau area. Where we now find children playing in the waves on a sweet summer day, there was once a day the water splashed around the legs of armed soldiers, men streaming out of boats, trickling onto the beach, spreading into the land on their way to stop a war. And now, Caen, France. It's the senseless demolition of decades of building. Streets that used to house families, people who were loved and missed, reduced to little more than rubble and devastation. Walking down the streets of Caen must have felt unreal during World War II, buildings and lives strewn about. But people are curiously stubborn creatures. The streets were rebuilt, cars line the streets now, and families have made new memories with those brand new walls. Hold up, don't go just yet. Next up, we'll take a look at troops making their way through small villages that were once in ruins, but have since been built anew with dedication and love. Places that once housed troops that are now given back to nature and to the public. And how did people get water during World War II? Well, let's find out. First up, Bernier-sur-Mer. On the morning of June 6, 1944, troops of the 3rd Canadian Infantry landed at Juno Beach. Of the 14,000 Canadian soldiers that were put ashore on the outskirts of Bernier-sur-Mer, 340 would lose their lives in the battles for the beachhead. Beach huts line the shoreline now, and there's an apartment building looking out to sea. Next, Omaha Beach, Normandy. American troops filled the dunes on Omaha Beach after the D-Day landings. The beaches are so quiet these days, it's impossible to imagine the roar of of war once raged across these very sands. Not a lot of dunes anymore though. Paved roads have taken their place along miles and miles of tranquil shoreline. Following Pointe du Hoc, France. This is where Colonel James E. Rutter established a post commando, a decision that was made after the assault at the cliffs of Pointe du Hoc by the 2nd Ranger Battalion. An American flag is deployed for signaling on Omaha Beach, and German prisoners are gathered. If you want, you can hike a trail that leads up to that corner between boulders and thorny bushes and sit where they sat, knowing that your view may have been very different if it wasn't for men like Colonel James E. Rutter. Next up, Saint-Lô, France. As lucky as many of the English town squares were, most French towns and villages were anything but lucky. Saint-Lô, for example, was almost completely destroyed by 2,000 Allied bombers when they attacked German troops that were stationed there during Operation Overlord. The price the innocent people of Saint-Lô and so many other places had to pay to end the war, most ruins were cleared, others were kept and still remain today and will always be places to remind us of the past, just like the memorial in the middle of the roundabout where once lay the ruins of a building. And now, Saint-Marie-du-Pont, France. Though indoor plumbing and running water were both widely available in the average home by the 1930s, war meant that wells and fountains quickly took back their status in society. After Saint-Marie-du-Pont was liberated by a group of paratroopers of the 501st and 506th Regiments of the 101st Airborne Division, you would find American soldiers waiting in line at the village fountain, children observing the scene. The village fountain doesn't work anymore, hasn't for some time now, but it's still there to visit and to remember. Following, Greenham Common Airfield, England. On June 5, 1944, Allied Forces Supreme Commander General Dwight D. Eisenhower spoke to the U.S. Army paratroopers of Easy Company, 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment, strike of the 101st Airborne Division at Greenham Common Airfield in England. Greenham Common Airfield was used by the United States Air Force during the Second World War and Cold War, and also spent some time being a base for nuclear weapons. But since 1997, the grounds have been designated as public parkland, and anyone who wants is welcome to roam the fields that were once home to American troops. Next up, Bernier-sur-Mer. The Notre Dame Nativity Church in Bernier-sur-Mer took some heavy blows during World War II. Large portions of the roof had collapsed, and the walls had more than a few gaping holes. But on June 6th, the first steps toward a normal life were starting to pop up through the glaring destruction war had left behind. You could see it in the posture of the people walking for the sake of walking instead of survival, and you could see it in the Canadian soldier standing in the middle of the road, calmly redirecting traffic. Today, you can't tell from looking at the church that this was once so heavily wounded, and there's no need for Canadian soldiers to redirect traffic as it's quiet during most times of the week. And at last, Sainte-Mère-Église, France. Many lives were lost during the war, all of them senseless but necessary. And despite all the pain and hardship, the French armored column that passed through the small French town of Sainte-Mère-Église were welcomed with open arms by its inhabitants. People streaming into the streets, hearts filled with relief and gratefulness. Crumbling walls, broken windows, and doors falling off their hinges, the backdrop of renewed hope in a future. Any future. Villages like this bounced back like no other, and walking through their streets is like walking through history. The only real difference is the paved roads and better insulated windows. And that was it. What do you think about these differences? Do you know what your corner of the world looked like during World War II? Let us know in the comments, and thanks for watching.